Hello YouTube, and welcome to my channel. Recently, Sargon posted this clip from his D&D campaign.
There is another matter that I would like to discuss with you, Your Holiness.
Go on.
Is water wet?
No, it makes other things wet.
I am unable to...
Sorry.
Why can't it also be wet itself, though?
Because it's water.
That's not really... You know what? Never mind.
Water makes other things wet, but water itself is not wet.
Why not?
Because it's the thing that makes other things wet.
But why couldn't it also be wet itself?
Because you can't get water on water.
So, this isn't just a stupid internet argument, but a discussion that gets at the heart of one of the most important philosophical innovations of Western history. Let's get a basic form of the problem to work with. 1. Things are wet when things have water on them. 2. If something isn't wet, then it is dry. Which leads us to 3. Suppose water is wet. Then 4. Water has water on it, according to premise 1. But 5. It is absurd to say that water has water on it. Thus, let us suppose the opposite, that 6. Suppose water is not wet. Then 7. Water must be dry, according to premise 2. But 8. It is absurd to say that water is dry. And therefore, 9, it appears that water is neither wet nor dry. So you should be able to recognize some of the points in at least an implied form in Sargon's video. Essentially, the crux of the problem is that water doesn't seem to be wet according to the definition of wet we are using, but it also doesn't seem to be dry. But wet and dry appear to be the only options we have. This is not just a problem with water. We agree that stop signs are red, as are strawberries and rubies. Given that, would we say that electromagnetic radiation with a wavelength of 700 nanometers, a frequency of 450 terahertz, and a photon energy of 1.8 electron volts is also red? Radiation with those or similar characteristics is certainly the thing that makes red things appear red to us, but it is not a thing that reflects redness in the same way that a stop sign does. So if it's red, it's not red in the same way that red objects are. Similarly, if water is wet, it's not wet in the same way wet objects are. This brings us to Parmenides. Parmenides was one of the great philosophers of the ancient Greek world. He argued that there was only one thing that existed, being, and that all apparent differences were but illusions. The argument runs basically this way. Suppose there was something other than being, but that which isn't being is non-being, and because non-being doesn't exist, therefore, the only thing that exists is being. For example, suppose wetness existed. Then either everything is wet, in which case wetness would be indistinguishable from being, or everything is dry, in which case wetness doesn't actually exist. Or some things would be wet, and other things would be dry, meaning being would be divided into wet and dry things. But if being is both wet and dry, then there is a contradiction. Therefore, the only thing that exists is being. This argument may sound silly, but it's hard to explain exactly why it's wrong. Of course, to deal with it, we turn to Socrates. In one of Plato's dialogues, the Parmenides, Socrates responds to this argument through the introduction of his theory of forms. The theory of forms, as expressed by Socrates, seeks to explain how many different things can share in the same qualities, like wetness, and yet be separate things. Socrates says one must posit that material things participate in immaterial but real forms, which in some sense are qualities in themselves. For example, wet things are wet because they participate in the form of wetness. Thus, against Parmenides' idea that the material world is the only thing that exists, and therefore it is an indivisible unity, since there is nothing that can divide it, Socrates introduces a dualistic system where immaterial forms exist, and these can divide matter into different categories of things. So wet things and dry things can both exist without creating a contradiction in being, because the form of wetness is in some sense outside the material universe. Parmenides responds to Socrates in this dialogue with one of the most beautiful philosophical traps in history, which has enthralled Western philosophy ever since. I'll reproduce it here, but changing the example he used to wetness just so we can stay thematically coherent. Parmenides says to Socrates, I imagine that the way in which you are led to assume one idea of wetness is as follows. You see a number of wet objects, and when you look at them, there seems to you to be one and the same idea, or nature, in them all. Hence, you conceive of wetness as one, and if you go on and allow your mind in like manner to embrace in one view the idea of wetness and of wet things, which are not the idea of wetness, and to compare them, will not another wetness arise, which will appear to be the source of all these? Then another idea of wetness now comes into view over and above absolute wetness, and the individuals which partake of it, and then another over and above all these, by virtue of which they will all be wet, and so each idea, instead of being one, will be infinitely multiplied. In other words, if we call two different things wet, in view of the fact that they participate in the form of wetness, then we must conclude that wetness is also wet, because it is what causes wetness in these two things. But now we have three wet things, and we need a second idea of wetness, we might call it super wetness, to explain the wetness in these three things. Obviously, this creates an infinite regress. This is called the third man argument. It's called the third man argument because it forces the creation of a third entity in order to explain a similarity between two other entities, which generates the regress. The beauty of this argument is only surpassed by Socrates' response. But may not the ideas, asks Socrates, be thoughts only, and have no proper existence except in our minds, Parmenides? For in that case, each idea may still be one, and not experience this infinite multiplication. Plato's response to Parmenides' third man argument was to place the form inside his mind, where it cannot be considered by the mind, but it is a part of the mind doing the considering. The form is not a capstone on a pyramid of different things which have a particular quality, it is a cause of that quality in those things. And this brings us back to Sargon's D&D game.
But that's not how you define wet necessarily.
Having water on it.
Not necessarily.
I think that's the definition of wet.
Yeah, that is one part of the definition. But
It's the
something
state of being covered or saturated with water and other.
but that doesn't answer the question of whether the water itself is wet. Also, by the way,
I mean,
water
it
does have water on it all the time.
Unfortunately, Arch doesn't finish the thought he began when he interrupted himself to make the far less interesting point that water has water on it. He began saying having water on it is only part of the definition of wetness, but it is not the only one. If he went on to finish the thought to say that we could analogously call water wet because it is the principle of wetness and that which causes wetness in other things, then Arch would be making the same point Socrates makes. Water is wet because wetness proceeds from water, in the same way that red electromagnetic radiation is red because it causes other things to appear red. Now, why is this important? Well, suppose Arch were to reverse the argument and go even further. Not only is water wet, but in fact, wetness, properly speaking, is a quality of water, and other things are only wet insofar as they participate in water, which is what we properly refer to as wet. Then Arch would be touching on the philosophical concept known as the analogy of being, or the analogy of existence, which comes from the Christian philosopher Thomas Aquinas. Replace wetness with existence. We can say that things exist, but only analogously, because these things might have not existed. We can only refer to them as existing in reference to their participation in a higher being, one that could not have not existed. I'm of course speaking of God. In the same way we know that water is wet because it is the cause of wetness in other things, and other things are properly called wet in reference to water, so we know that there must be a being that is the cause or principle of existence, in relation to which we can refer to things as existing. This is the ipsum esse subsistens, being itself subsisting, which is known to all as God. So there you have it. From an argument that came out of a D&D game, we got a good introduction to Christian metaphysics. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and consider becoming a patron. Links are in the description. Until next time, I'm Benedict the 17th. Go with God.